That's not here yet because the tuna haven't migrated across the Pacific. But I'm thinking that by about 2013, we might see contamination of the water and of the top of the food chain fishes as they on the West Coast.
Well, but I keep hearing the Pacific is a really big ocean. Yeah, that old saw has been trouted out a lot, and I think what they're missing here in those stories, of course, is what you've mentioned, which is the bioaccumulation, which is that these are many of these isotopes mimic really important elements, and so our bodies preferentially take them up, but so do microorganisms, and then they all get eaten by something larger than them, and so on as we go. And over the course of that, we should all be familiar with this, because this is how mercury tends to bioaccumulate. This is how a lot of toxins bioaccumulate. So we're really talking about the concentration of radioactive particles. And you mentioned that you have some assessment that more radioactivity has landed in the Pacific Ocean than did in the Black Sea from Chernobyl. Do you have a sense of how much you think has gone in?
Well, actually, it's Woods Hole, and they're certainly a reputable scientific organization. They're saying 10 times more. And yes, the Pacific's big, but we're still talking about what's there now. And I think it's important for everyone to understand that we're not out of the woods. You know, when Chernobyl was over, we're still 10 times what Chernobyl was over, and we're still have no end in sight for releases from Fukushima, and it's already 10 times that. I am concerned. We've already seen small fish on the order of 4 or 5 inch fish as far away as 50 miles containing cesium levels of 10 to 50 times higher than allowable. And of course, those fish are going to get eaten by bigger fish up the food chain, so it's a concern. Seaweed seems to absorb iodine, but it also absorbs cesium, which is something that I just learned. I was worried. I was telling people, don't worry about seaweed after 90 days because the iodine's all gone. But I'm not sure about that at this point because, as I understand it now, it can also absorb the cesium. So I'm a little unsure on that science.
Well, fortunately, the EPA has a rigorous testing program in place, right?
Right. Trust me, I'm from the government.
Right. Yeah, unfortunately on that. So this is part of the environmental legacy of Fukushima. And, oh, by the way, I should mention in my research I came across the idea that shellfish, and particularly crabs and other crustaceans, will accumulate cesium pretty heavily in their shells. So we might want to add shellfish to the cesium story there as well. I think if I lived there personally, I would just be avoiding all seafood from the Pacific, as you mentioned. I think that's sage advice at this point, until and unless we had a really believable and aggressive monitoring program. I would be personally leery myself. But can you talk to us? What really then are the health risks that you think are faced by those who live in or near the reactor at this point on the reactor complex?
Well, there's a large plume of radioactivity that moved to the north and to the west, out as far as 50 miles. That I don't know how you're going to clean it up economically. You know, there's cesium deposition higher than the forbidden zones of Chernobyl, out 50 miles, just in that northwesterly direction. So again, thank God the wind was blowing mainly out to sea. I think it's going to boil down to, does Japan want to spend the money? But I can't imagine people ever getting back into the 20-kilometer zone, especially in that northwestern quadrant, rather. It just is going to cost way too much to decontaminate that land. Farming is going to be a problem out as well because, again, cows and cattle will absorb cesium for years to come. You know, we're seeing that in Germany after Chernobyl. We're still seeing, 30 years ago, wild boars in Germany that eat mushrooms are still contaminated with cesium. So this is not a problem that goes away in a generation. You know, it hangs around for quite a while. I think there's two cost issues here. I think the cost, and it really does boil down to money at some point. The cost to decontaminate the site is probably going to be on the order of $30 to $50 billion. Normally, decommissioning is around $1 billion to decommission a plant that's relatively clean. But each of these plants has got a molten blob of fuel at the bottom, which is territory that no one's ever assessed, and that's just the site. So I'm thinking that a $30 to $50 billion hit for the nation of Japan, because I don't think TEPCO can afford it, as well as contamination further inland, could easily be $100 billion more. Now, I put that out on my website, and I had people say, "Oh no, it's never going to be that high." But of course, it'll be a long time before we get there. And some of those costs might get mixed up with tsunami costs as well. But it wouldn't surprise me in excess of $100 billion to decontaminate that area within 20 or 30 kilometers of Fukushima would be a realistic number.
And when we say decontaminate, I mean, so I guess you scrub surfaces, but once you've got the stuff down to the soil level, don't you do what they did in Chernobyl? I mean, what can you do besides carve the top number of inches off and cart it away and pile it up somewhere? Is there more that can be done?
No, there's not. Basically, it becomes a disposal somewhere, so it's going to go to somebody's backyard. And cesium is quite water soluble, so it does move down through the soil over time. There is, again, some work with zeolite that seems to indicate that you can lay down some zeolite and it will pull the cesium back out. But you're talking about hundreds of square miles here. So this is a little more than a science project.
Wow, I'm really still a little bit shocked that you were able to receive air filters through the mail, I presume, in some way, that came in with some contamination on them, and this is something I've been focused on for a while, is trying to assess what the real economic impacts are going to be outside of the borders of Japan. A very important manufacturing industrial center, critical in certain supply chains. Maybe we'll find ways to mitigate that over time, but for now they have a bunch of critical functions, and just worrying about what might happen to their import-export balance if it turns out that there's more evidence of these sort of strange contamination moments popping up. Hey, it's in the sludge. Oops, it's in air filters. Wait a minute, it's on. They don't really. It could end up anywhere. What do you have any insight into what sort of supply chain disruptions you might expect at this point, or how they might manage this process of importing, exporting, given everything needs to be checked for contamination, and how you would go about that? What are we facing here?
Well, I was a little bit surprised that Hillary Clinton made some sort of a pact with the Japanese to try to encourage buying Japanese food and vegetables. Clearly, the food and vegetable chain, I think we already talked about. I think the large industrial products like automobiles and their transistors and computers and things like that are probably going to be just fine. The boxes they're made in, I might be a little bit concerned about, and that they're shipped in. But I would expect that the shippers would be on top of that, because the last thing Sony wants is a crate load of televisions coming up contaminated because the boxes are contaminated. So I think the big guys are going to be alert to that. The Mitsubishis and the Sonys and the Hitachis, and are going to watch that a lot. It's the intermediate people in the market, the small manufacturers. Who there's some clay pots coming out of Japan and things like that, and I'm hoping that there'll be some kind of government monitoring on that, because without that, I don't have any confidence of what kind of product I'm buying.
Right. So, all right. So to wrap this up, I'm just interested in for all of our listeners who may live in Japan or live on the West Coast or wherever they happen to be. If there's an aftershock and if Building 4 sort of topples over, what would your advice be? I heard your advice to the people in Japan. Get on a plane if possible, or get far away, or know which way the wind is moving and go the other direction. What would you do if you were in the United States and you saw that had happened?
Well, I'm in touch with some scientists now who have been monitoring the air on the West Coast. And in Seattle, for instance, in April, the average person in Seattle breathed in 10 hot particles a day.
What? I did not know that.
Well, the reports, it's just science, so it takes some time to make its way into the literature. But if the average human being breathes about 10 meters a day of air, cubic meters a day of air, and air samplers out in the Seattle area are detecting, when they pull, 10 cubic meters through them. This is in April now, so we're at the end of May, so it's a better situation now. But that air filter will have 10 hot particles on it. Now, and that was before the Unit 4 issue. Clearly, you know, we all can't run south of the equator to our second homes in Rio or something like that. Yeah. But it will stay north of the equator for anyone who has a Learjet and can get out. But I guess what I'm advising at that point is keep your windows closed. I would definitely wear some sort of a filter when I was outside. I certainly wouldn't run and exercise until I was sure the plume had dissipated. This isn't now. This is, as you were saying, this is worst case. But if Unit 4 were to topple, I would close my windows, turn the air conditioner on, replace the filters frequently, damp mop, put a HEPA filter in the house, and try to avoid as much of the hot particles as possible. You're not going to walk out with a Geiger counter and be in a plume that's going to that's going to peg the meter. The issue will be on the West Coast hot particles, and the solution there is HEPA filters and avoiding them. There's also potentially some medical issues. Maggie and I and Fairwinds have been working with a couple of doctors to look at ways to mitigate, to help your body cleanse particles if you know you've been exposed to them. But that's a little bit premature to go into much more detail on that.
Right. But this is all worst case, and we're just going to keep our eyes on it. I think the important message here is that the situation is not yet over. It's something we're going to have to keep our eyes on, which is tricky because the media tends to not have a very long attention span when it comes to these things. But in your estimation, it's still an evolving situation over there. There could still be some curveballs. It's possible that there might be a steam explosion at 3. There might be a toppling event at Building 4. These are some of the key risks we're going to keep our eyes on the lookout for. Is there anything else to this story you want to add?
No, it's going to be a long slog.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Arnie. It's just been a fabulous conversation. And again, where should people go if they want to follow you and find out more?
Well, Martinson has an O in it, but Gundersen has an E in it. So, and so does Fairwinds. FAIREWINDS.com is our blog, and it's our website rather. And Maggie and I are doing it for free. We're not. It's been volunteer work. We do have a donate button to keep our computer whiz computing, but it's not for profit venture.
Of course, is what you've mentioned, which is the bioaccumulation, which is that these are many of these isotopes mimic really important elements, and so our bodies preferentially take them up, but so do microorganisms, and then they all get eaten by something larger than them, and so on as we go. And over the course of that, we should all be familiar with this, because this is how mercury tends to bioaccumulate. This is how a lot of toxins bioaccumulate. So we're really talking about the concentration of radioactive particles. And you mentioned that you have some assessment that more radioactivity has landed in the Pacific Ocean than did in the Black Sea from Chernobyl. Do you have a sense of how much you think has gone in?
Well, actually, it's Woods Hole, and they're certainly a reputable scientific organization. They're saying 10 times more. And yes, the Pacific's big, but we're still talking about what's there now. And I think it's important for everyone to understand that we're not out of the woods. When those fish are going to get eaten by bigger fish up the food chain. So it's a concern. Seaweed seems to absorb iodine, but it also absorbs cesium, which is something that I just learned. I was worried. I was telling people, don't worry about seaweed after 90 days because the iodine's all gone. But I'm not sure about that at this point because, as I understand it now, Chernobyl was over. We're still 10 times what Chernobyl was over, and we're still have no end in sight for releases from Fukushima, and it's already 10 times that. I am concerned. We've already seen small fish on the order of 4 or 5 inch fish as far away as 50 miles containing cesium levels of 10 to 50 times higher than allowable. And so that's not here yet because the tuna haven't migrated across the Pacific. But I'm thinking that by about 2013, we might see contamination of the water and of the top of the food chain fishes as they on the West Coast.
But I keep hearing the Pacific is a really big ocean. That old saw has been trouted out a lot, and I think what they're missing here in those stories, of